Hopefully I have enough cloud space there on my Zoom account.
Oh, okay.
Let me know when you want to get started or if we're waiting for anybody.
I'm not sure if the Head Start people could hear me. Do you know if any other Head Start people are going to be around?
Well, there's a couple people connecting to audio. We're going to get started here in a couple minutes. I'm going to let people kind of trickle in and make sure that everybody's audio is connected.
Is your camera off or what?
Are we waiting for anybody from the college, Sean?
No, they're all on. Wotes again, Serena are on.
Okay.
They're sharing the computer.
Okay. I'm just going to grab my water bottle and then we'll get started. Okay. Alrighty. White hippies naqspelil tinchai squeeze mkhaychnat is squeeze kriwal shula is in qalo squeeze mkhaychnat kintil inchalium. My name is Kriwal Shula. I am from Inchalem, Washington on the Cabo Reservation. My great-grandfather was actually Chippewa Cree and Assiniboine Sioux, so I do have some ancestry from that area over there in Montana, as well as the Flathead Salish people. I have had the privilege to kind of grow up in the language revitalization effort. Both of my parents were second language learners and teachers of the Okanagan Salish dialect, which is the dialect that I primarily speak of the Southern Interior Salish languages. And so I grew up learning it, and I started off actually in my very first job was when I was 15, creating labels for a Head Start classroom. And so I've been involved in language ever since. And so I've been a teacher trainee, which involved many hours of early childhood training. And I've also been an immersion school teacher, and that means that the an immersion school is a school that you only speak the native language, you don't speak any English. And when I was an immersion school teacher, I worked with pre-kindergarten and kindergarten age children, so that early childhood age. And then I was also a Head Start teacher when I moved back to the reservation. My reservation, I was the Head Start teacher, the lead teacher for a while there as well. I've been a language program manager. I've done a lot of curriculum. So my role, I have a contract with the Administration for Native Americans, which is also under the ACF. And so I serve as a training and technical assistance director. So we have a cohort of 5 grantees, which Aaniiih Nakota College is one of the grantees that I assist in all their language revitalization needs, whether that's administrative, whether that's curriculum, this type of training. And so that is, my role is to help bridge the gaps within the communities that all of these grantees serve. And so today I want to talk about the importance of native language in regards to early childhood development. I'm at home. We're still quarantining a little bit, so forgive me that I have a little bit of background noise going on. My kids are just coming in to grab some some drinks. So I wanted to talk about the Head Start mission statement really quick, and that is to promote the school readiness of young children from low-income families by enhancing their cognitive, social, and emotional development. And so what I really want to do with this training is to put together the pieces and how language and culture can really help support that mission statement of Head Start. Before I go into that, I also wanted to address just the critical importance that we play as early childhood educators in working with Native American children. So this comes from a document that was developed by the United States Department of Justice that Native American and Alaska Native children experience post-traumatic stress disorder at the same rate as combat veterans who return from Iraq and Afghanistan, and triple the rate of the general population. And that has huge impacts on brain development. So childhood provides the best time frame to decrease the lifelong effects of trauma. The older we get, the harder it becomes to battle it. So that early intervention is super critical. So just general brain development information here. Healthy babies are born with approximately 100 billion neurons, and neurons all hold information. They communicate with each other. That's how we hear, that's how we see, that's how we speak. And so whether or not these neurons make connections or whether or not they die depends on the child's environment. The cerebral cortex of a healthy toddler can produce up to 2 million synaptic connections per second. And by the time children are 2 years old, their brains have approximately 100 trillion synapses. So the way that I like to, and I'm sure you guys have a lot of training in regards to brain development, being in Head Start. But I like to make sure that, we're all on the same page. So the way that I envision brain cells, because I talk about it a lot, neurons, brain cells, and synaptic connections, is like the internet. So a brain cell is just like a web page. You go to that web page, it holds information, and then there's links within those web pages that you can click on, and it'll take you to another web page. So if you think of, if you click on a link that might be old because it's not being used, and it says like error, that's because that link is broken, right? So those links that go between the web pages are like the synaptic connections. And so it's actually a child's brain has more brain cells or neurons than the whole internet has websites. So there's a child's brain is born with so many of these websites, and whether or not those websites can link to other websites is really dependent on their environment and their experiences growing up. So the brain develops in a bottom-up direction. So when a baby is born, you'll see that they, oh, I'm sorry, you just lost, probably lost my screen there. Oh, here we go. when a baby is born, they can, they blink, they move their arms. So the very bottom of the brain controls all the unconscious actions of the body. So blinking, breathing, and then from there it develops like the midbrain. So I know, when a baby is born and you're holding that baby, they say that their vision is the distance between the crease of the mother's arm and the mother's face. So they can see their mother when they're born, and the rest beyond that is blurry. And so as their brain develops to their midbrain, which is where their vision is located at, they can see farther and farther. They start to see color. And that really starts to produce pretty rapidly. So the upper region of the brain, which is, here's the bottom, middle, and then the upper region of the brain is responsible for executive function, cognition, and language. So executive function is memory, it's decision making, it's inhibition, to be able to control your emotions and how you respond to certain situations. So here's just a visual, here's the lower brain, middle, and then the upper brain. So those synaptic connections, or the website links that I was talking about earlier, are strengthened by repeated use. And the more you use that link or that connection, the more it gets cemented into your brain. And the connections that are not used will get pruned. So when I was saying earlier, those old websites that haven't been, nobody's updated them in like 20 years, and you click on it and it says error, that's pruning. And so everybody's brain prunes, which is it's a natural process, and it serves its purpose. It makes the brain more efficient, right? Just like you would prune a tomato bush to get, you prune the little leaves to get better fruit, right? So that's what the brain does. And so, but what happens, what can happen is certain connections that can be strengthened that shouldn't be strengthened, or certain things get pruned that shouldn't be pruned. So, for example, there was a study where they taped little cotton balls over these kittens' eyes. Kittens are blind anyways when they're born, or their eyes are shut. So they taped over their eyes where their eyes were still shut, and they kept those little cotton balls on their eyes longer than the kittens would have opened their eyes. So then by the time they took those little cotton balls off, those kittens were blind because they were not exposed to visual stimulation. And so their brain says, oh, we're not using this. We're going to prune this ability to see. So that's why it's so important to address, while the brain's developing, some of these issues. So here's a cool little visual from the University of, I believe this is UC Berkeley, came up with this video, or produced this video. Let's see if and that's what messages look like in the brain. It's electricity. So messages get sent from neuron to neuron on those little synaptic connections. So as you're physically seeing this right here, this is what your brain's doing. It's responding to the visual input, it's responding to my voice, and your brain is lighting up and sending messages to interpret what you're seeing and to interpret what you're hearing. So there is a physiological response to trauma, emotional abuse, and neglect. So chronic stress has many effects on the brain. It can physically decrease the size, just the general size of the brain. It can decrease those connectivities, so those little electricity or those little lines, and it can reduce volume in the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is super important because that is the learning and memory and emotion center of the brain. And so by volume, they mean like the amount of brain cells that are in there. So it can reduce volume in that area. It reduces volume in the corpus callosum, which is a nerve tract that connects the two hemispheres of your brain. So you all are in Head Start, or most of you are working with early childhood age group. And I'm sure you've experienced a child who will just get triggered out of kind of what feels like out of nowhere, and they'll just scream, or they'll just like they can't tell you what's wrong, they just react. Well, on the right side of your brain, this deals with emotion and feelings. Well, on the left side of your brain, this deals with like articulation and like technical stuff. So if they're feeling something over here and they can't send it over through the corpus callosum, they cannot verbally articulate what they're feeling. So that corpus callosum is super important for interpreting between emotion and speech or any kind of language stuff. Anyways, decreased volume in the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is responsible for your motor function. Smaller prefrontal cortex, overactive amygdala, decreased electrical activity, and less development of the upper brain. So trauma, even though it's emotional, or it can be physical, but there's emotional trauma, there's neglect, all of those can cause a physical injury on the brain, especially like fetal alcohol or drug affected, that also really impacts their brain as well. So I also talk about the gray matter and white matter. So what gray matter is the little wrinkly parts of your brain, that's where all the brain cells get stored in your brain. And so that's why the brain is wrinkly, so it has more surface area to hold brain cells. And so gray matter, the density refers to the amount of brain cells in that area. And then the white matter is the connections, so the links that connect one brain cell to another and how they communicate. So, I mean, obviously physical injury can also result and have an impact on the brain structure, just the same as, emotional. Another thing that I want to talk about is epigenetics, that we also incur epigenetic trauma. So they did this research on like mice or rats. And what they did is they would expose these rats to the smell of cherry blossoms, and simultaneously they would shock these rats as they were exposed to this smell. And they continuously did that. And what they did later is those rats that were exposed to that smell and shock had babies, and then they didn't do that to the babies. But then what they did is they exposed those little rat babies that didn't actually experience that shock. And those rat babies were averse to the smell. They just did not react very well to that smell because it had imprinted on their DNA that that smell means shock, right? And so, when you think in terms of historical trauma and the experiences that our ancestors have gone through, and even at the hands of other human beings, right? And so how do we respond even now to interacting with humans? And, I think of things, like the lateral violence or kind of perceiving things as threats. In one way that this has manifested in myself as far as epigenetics is in my own health. And so, in my mid-20s, I was diagnosed with a fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is insulin resistance. And I wasn't even particularly overweight, and I was young, and that is a direct result of starvation. So somewhere along my grandma's line, because there's a whole wealth of insulin resistance on my mom's side, somewhere along her line, there was starvation, and it resulted in an overproduction of like insulin, or it threw off my own insulin hormonal regulation. And so now I have health issues in regards to insulin because of the starvation and how that impacts. Because, if you starve, it's going to change your DNA for your future generations that they can withstand famine better, right? So I'm built better for famine, but I'm not, I don't experience famine. So then it throws off my, my genetics. So here's another, we talked about earlier, is how experiences, those connections that are repeatedly used start to become really engraved into the brain's wiring. And so what winds up happening is that if we have a fear response system. And so when we experience stress, it activates a physiological response in our bodies. We get adrenaline rushes, our heartbeats start to pound, and stress hormone, the cortisol, starts to secrete. And so what happens if there's a consistent stress activation for children, particularly who do not have at least one caring adult to support them, what it results in is a continued state of fear. So what happens is that their brain, if they have an abusive home or a chronic, or even neglect, experiencing chronic neglect, their brain then becomes wired to be in that state chronically. So even though children come to school and they know it's safe, consciously they might know it's a safe place, they're not going to get hurt, but their brain is still experiencing like fight or flight type of state. So they're always on. And so they always have to feel like they're either going to fight or flight all the time. And so it really makes it difficult for children to be in a relaxed and calm state, because if your body's saying, hey, you're going to either need to fight or flight, which requires a lot of physical exertion and movement, it's going to send all of its activity to the lower part of your brain to get ready to move. And so if your brain is down here all the time, it's not up here working on any kind of cognitive, executive function, language skills, right? And so it makes it really hard for children to cognitively develop. And then just mental health. So maltreatment can affect the connectivity between the amygdala and the hippocampus, and this can initiate the development of anxiety and depression by late adolescence. Emotional abuse in childhood or neglect in childhood can affect the brain's ability to use serotonin, and that is the brain's natural feel-good hormone. And this is where drug addiction is considered a disease because it's a brain injury. So serotonin is what makes our brains feel happy. So for example, in the morning when I have my coffee and I have my window rolled down and the weather's just right and my favorite song is on and I just feel really good, like you feel that serotonin, right? You just feel good. That's your natural happy chemical. It might have something to do with the coffee too, but that's that feeling, right? But what happens, imagine serotonin as a shower, the water coming out of a shower head. And that's what gets you clean, right? So now imagine a shower that has like great water pressure and you're getting clean and it's nice and warm and it feels, you know, it's just really quick. You can clean up and good. But then imagine a shower head that just barely trickles and it's cold. And then that's what the serotonergic function, if it gets damaged, it's that cold, low water pressure function. Now imagine being a teenager, having those low water pressure, cold showers your whole life and getting in a car accident and having to get prescribed oxytocin or OxyContin or hydrocodone. And then all of a sudden your shower's just blasting at full force and just really warm and it feels so good. And you don't want to ever go back to a cold, low shower pressure again, right? So that's childhood abuse can physically damage your brain's natural ability to have that normal water pressure. And so it's really important to address that in childhood to make sure that because this childhood adversity can lower serotonergic function permanently, it can permanently damage that function in a child's brain. So when children feel safe and nurtured, they're able to be up here in their upper brain. They're able to focus on these learning to talk, bonding with people, creating relationships. But if they feel safe and threatened, they're focused on just survival. They're hyper alert just to sense the environment for any kind of threats that they might experience. So here's some needs of a child. These are basic needs, right? Security, stability, consistency, emotional support, love, education, positive role models, and structure. Stability comes from family and community. and kids really need to be part of a larger unit to give them a sense of belonging, tradition, and cultural continuity. So even children having an identity as being part of a larger community, whether or not they have a stable home life, that sense of community, that identity that they get in language and culture really feeds into this sense of stability that can be provided to young children. So we just talked a whole lot about, you know, trauma and its effects on the brain, and really how it directly impacts that cognitive, social, you know, the mission statement of Head Start. And not only that, but the rates of trauma that Native children experience and how that is a really big deal for our communities. This is how, now I'm moving into how language and culture really can help address those issues. So there's just a wealth of knowledge that just second language learning, bilingualism in general, is super beneficial for cognitive function. So there's two levels. There's the benefits of just learning more than one language, and then there's the benefits of learning your own native language. And so there's just any language in general has huge cognitive benefits in regards to memory, problem solving, attention, decision making. And it also, you know, as an adult, you have improvement in your cognitive function as well. It's not just beneficial for children, it's beneficial for adults, especially in staving off like dementia and Alzheimer's. Oops. Acquiring more language allows the brain to maintain neural connections that would have been lost through pruning in monolingual people. Languages all have unique syntax, which is the word order, phonemes, which is the sounds, and cadence, which is the rhythm. So your brain retains the ability to distinguish between these languages. So for example, I know that on your guys' reservation, you have 2 languages. Well, there may be issues that come up in regards to, from my reservation as well, we have 3, Nez Perce, Okanagan, and Moses Columbia. And so just knowing or being able to understand that regardless if you're learning the language that's not your particular tribe, or if a child comes in and they're learning, maybe they're Nakota and they're learning Aaniiih, or they're Aaniiih and they're learning Nakota, either way they will reap the benefits of these connections. And if they grow up and decide that they want to learn whichever one, already having that experience of 2 languages makes your brain way more receptive to learn more after that. Because as an adult, if you're learning a native language and English is your only point of reference, it can make it really hard. But if you have 2 languages as your point of reference, it makes it, your brain is already open to new ways of communicating that aren't English. So it retains a lot of those connections that might have been pruned otherwise. Studies demonstrate that children who are exposed to bilingual education have an increased ability to problem solve, and they're also better at divergent thinking. So what divergent thinking is the ability to problem solve and come up with a solution that has not been used before. So it's like a creativity kind of a thinking. So convergent thinking is remembering, oh yeah, that's how we solve that problem, and then they do something that's already been taught to them. But divergent thinking is being really super innovative in how they solve problems. Oh yeah, I didn't, okay. Utilizing existing solutions, innovative outside the box solutions. There's also studies that talk about the memory. There's just increased ability both in semantic and episodic memory. Semantic is kind of like rote memorization, and episodic is just being able to recall a situation. And so those are, there's some positive memory recall in bilingual children. Academic success, when Native students' language and culture are a part of their education, research shows that retention rates, attendance rates, and overall academic achievement improve. So it used to be that Maori students used to only 5 to 15% would graduate high school. Now they turned all their schools into immersion instruction, and their graduation rates are at 75%. So they completely flipped those rates just by switching to immersion. Research shows that language learning improves academic success in the following ways: increased scores on standardized tests, higher reading proficiency, higher test scores in science and math, and increased linguistic awareness. So just here's some case studies that showing that Cherokee children who received bilingual education scored higher on math and reading assessments. Navajo students receiving bilingual education scored higher on SAT and MAT than students with English language instruction only. Health benefits, so these are various studies, but they found that communities who had higher language and cultural retention had lower suicide rates, had lower domestic violence rates, had lower rates of drug use, alcohol abuse, rates of cigarette smoking, and even decreased rates of diabetes. And this was specific to language. This did not include cultural continuity as a factor. This only addresses language with, I think I said culture earlier, but it was just the language. Emotional benefits, so Native children who learn their language have higher confidence in their own abilities, higher levels of self-esteem, and decreased levels of anxiety. Connecting Indian youth with their language and culture increases their resiliency to addiction, prevents risky behavior, and promotes positive health and well-being. So another thing that I like to address is the importance of cultural practices. And I see culture as two levels, right? There's the physical culture, which is drumming and singing and clothing and food, but there's also another level of culture, which is how you treat one another, your values, prayer, things that you can't physically see or touch. And so, and the importance of maintaining those within that, because in my own personal research regarding brain-based teaching, our culture, our cultural practices are way more conducive to brain-based learning than Western public education models. And so I'll go through and I'll show you how our language and culture is actually brain-based in regards to teaching our children. And I feel like also there's a fear, you know, for me, myself, I'm second generation away from boarding school, and we still have a lot of fear as Native people that comes along with that. And, you know, we've been conditioned our whole life to believe that the Western is superior and that the States, you know, these standards and these objectives and all these things are what our children need to learn. And so just kind of unpacking some of that fear and being able to feel comfortable again in our own culture, in our own language. So these are kind of some general important values that I feel like kind of go across the board with Native communities in that connection with land and nature. For us, we talk about how our language was actually given to us by the land and the animals. So having that connection with the earth, community and relationships, respect for elders, arts in singing and dancing, and just visual art, prayer, gratitude, ceremony, and humor. So I also like to talk about endorphins, or also just happy chemicals. So endorphins are a group of hormones secreted within the brain and the nervous system, and having a number of physiological functions. They activate the body's opiate receptors, causing an analgesic effect. So what endorphins do is they actually fight against stress hormones. So the more endorphins or happy chemicals that you can produce, the more it fights against like toxic cortisol, toxic stress, and it relaxes the brain, and it increases cognitive, learning function. So there's also 6 pathways to the brain, and those are through the 5 senses and physically doing something. So I'm going to start with humor. And so again, endorphins are the feel-good chemicals released by the brain that triggers the reward center. It can also improve your immune system, and it fights against the cortisol, which is the hormone triggered by stress. And stress can physically shrink the brain, or cortisol can, toxic amounts of cortisol. And then it can also cause anxiety and depression. So this is what happiness looks like. And so humor reduces cortisol and it increases the mood state that is conducive to learning. So this is a protein dragging an endorphin. So when you are able to laugh and have fun, it reduces cortisol in your brain. There's also, I forgot to include this part, but there's a lot of studies that talk about once the fun stops, the learning stops, and that it's so important to be interested in what it is that you're learning. So I do apologize for today. I'm sure this is not the most exciting delivery or format, so I'm going against my own advice here. So land and nature, indigenous languages, a lot of them were born in nature. Many tribal people identify themselves by the physical or natural attributes of the land they live on. So for example, when I say that I am Aaniiih, that means that I'm the people of a person of the speckled fish. So we are a part of nature. There's not this separation that kind of exists today with a more Western style of living. But here's some studies that talk about exposure to green spaces, nature. Lifelong exposure to greenness was positively associated with gray matter volume in the left and right prefrontal cortex, and in the left premotor cortex, and with the white matter volume in the right prefrontal region, in the left premotor region, and both cerebral hemispheres. So basically this is saying that just exposure, just being in a space that's green, leaves, grass, brushes, increases that gray matter, the neuron density, and the white matter, those connections in the brain. Sunlight facilitates the body's production of vitamin D, which every single cell in your body has a vitamin D receptor. So vitamin D can help increase dopamine production, and dopamine is considered a happy chemical. Lifelong exposure to greenness, oh, I already did that one, sorry. Repeat on accident. Not only does it have chemical responses, but the outdoor exploration stimulates all of the senses. So we were talking about earlier how there's 6 pathways to the brain. And so outdoor, they can feel the wind, they can feel the different textures of like grass or rock or dirt, the sensations, whether things are wet or dry. They can observe like visually natural phenomena, smells. There's a lot more different smells that occur outside than indoors. And so this really stimulates brain development in early childhood. In addition to sunlight, so sunlight actually, the UVB rays, those exposures, it gets perceived through the eye, and it helps that serotonin production. So we were talking about earlier how trauma can damage that serotonergic function permanently. Well, sunlight helps to regulate that production. So being outside, being in the sun can really help. If children are experiencing trauma, that is a really strong prevention method to kind of help them regulate that production. Soil contains good bacteria. I'm not going to read that, the word for it, but this bacteria triggers the production of serotonin and increases mood and cognitive function. So again, helping regulate that serotonergic, getting them to produce it on their own. And then here is another experiment. They said that a 50-minute walk in an arboretum improved executive attention skills, such as short-term memory, while walking along a city street did not. Imagine a therapy that had no known side effects, was readily available, and could improve your cognitive functioning at zero cost. The researchers wrote in their paper, it exists and it is called interacting with nature. So and then just being outside promotes, you know, you're moving. And so even the simple act of like standing up will increase blood flow, and blood carries oxygen. And so when you increase blood flow, like standing up and walking around, you're getting more oxygen to your brain, and your mental performance then increases as a result of that physical movement. So being outside, walking, doing something gives children higher performance. Another thing is that they had these experiments with, they're called nature education classrooms, I believe, NEC for their acronym. And what they did several experiments with children who are Head Start age. And so they took these children outdoors and they made sure that there was like natural loose materials, that there was like bugs and different things that were able to kind of be around. They added materials like buckets and shovels and different things that they can manipulate their environment, but it was really had a lot of like wood and rocks and grass and brush and things that they could interact with. And then they just kind of stepped back and they just observed the children. They didn't direct any kind of lessons. They didn't direct any activity. They just wrote down what the children did. And what they found out was that children on their own, given these materials, given this environment, worked on these categories for math. So they did just on their own, just by their own natural play. They worked on classification, estimation, geometric shapes, one-to-one correspondence counting, whole part relationships, scale relationships, sequencing and seriation, volume, time concepts, computational skills, matching, fractions, numbers and counting, quantity, and measurement. So this is just on their own. The teacher stood by to kind of support or to ask open-ended questions to get them thinking more on what they were doing and encourage mathematical thinking, but they just let the children kind of lead their activities. And so just showing the different types of mathematical, you know, skills. I know that that's a big area in Head Start, is just kind of getting patterning, one-to-one correspondence, quantity, those measurements, right, is really important for that age group. So just kind of visually seeing the different kind of patterns that children see as they're in nature. I remember being little and like just really focusing on one of these shells because we had a creek right by our house. And so I'd like find all these little shells, and then I would just look at them, and then I would see that they're all different sizes, right? And so you just, children are naturally curious about these kinds of things, and those are all available in nature. Patterns and seriation, this is just a cedar branch. So you can see how there's a pattern, left, right, left, right, left, right. But then there's also seriation as it goes from, you know, tall to kind of short, and it tapers off in the tip. This is one of our traditional foods in this area. I'm not sure if you guys use it, but it's brown camas. I'm just showing how to compare the sizes and using hands. So like traditionally, Native people use their body parts for measurement. So like either a hand tall or a hand this way, or fingers, you know, it's 2 fingers big or 3 fingers. And that's how we would kind of measure, you know, different things. And so incorporating some traditional kinds of math as in conjunction with cultural activities. Here's another example. So this is an example from my childhood, is that sweat rocks. You know, they're, my parents went and got some new sweat rocks for our sweat that we had, and they asked me to help carry it from the truck to where our sweat was. And so I remember this is my first time ever really touching one. And so I went and I picked it up, and I just remember being like so surprised at how light it was. Like I expected it to be so much heavier. And I remember my mom I asked her, you know, why does this feel so light? And she told me because of the air pockets, that it doesn't have as much rock in it, and so it's lighter than a similar size rock that didn't have holes in it, right? So that was my first experience ever with mass density of matter, which I was introduced later in elementary. So I learned it first. I learned mass density of matter first in a cultural context before I ever learned it in like a public school. Another example is from my own childhood. You can see here, this is we had an earth home, and then this was our regular, you know, house that we lived in, and there's a path that you had to go down to get to that earth home. And so we had some elders visiting our house, and my mom and dad wanted to take them down to the earth home. And I remember that path was covered in dry pine needles. And I remember thinking to myself, like, oh, I need to go get those pine needles. I was like 7. And I was thinking, I need to go get those pine needles off of that trail because they could slip on them and fall. And so before I ever learned it in school, I understood the concept of static friction, which is a physics concept, because a dry pine needle and a dry dirt doesn't have any friction, and so you can slip, it'll slip and they could fall. And so I learned that from just being in nature, again, before I ever learned it in a public school education setting. So that was just land-based relationships. You know, I feel like Native people are really value relationships and community and social, you know, we come together in times of need and stuff. And our brains are naturally social. As children learn by observations and imitation of adults. And so it's just being together, that togetherness, and really promoting that community and social relationships is super important. And also having those emotional connections triggers the production of oxytocin. Oxytocin is the chemical that bonds people. So when a baby is born, they produce oxytocin, and a mother's brain also produces oxytocin, and they call it like the love hormone. And it also increases trust between people when that oxytocin is produced. And positive social interaction reduces cortisol, again, increases the production of oxytocin. Positive touch like a hug, handshake, hand on the shoulder, all of those can produce oxytocin. So and you know, some kids aren't really super huggers, you know, they might feel weird about it. And that's okay. You know, you can find ways to kind of get around that. I had a kid who was like drug affected, and he wasn't too big on like any kind of like affection, at least in the beginning. And so what I would, and he was like hair trigger. He just had a lot of, you know, anger issues, and he just would come in sometimes, and I knew, oh my gosh, it's going to be a long day. And so what I would do when he would come in and I could kind of tell that he's feeling edgy or irritable already, I played this little game where I would kind of grab him, just not hard, but I'd grab him by the cheeks, and I would say, let me look in your mouth. And I would squeeze his little cheeks open and look in his mouth, and I'd say, oh my gosh, there's grumpies in there. I can see those grumpies. And they said, we gotta squeeze them out, and gotta shake them out. And I would grab them and I'd kind of shake them, just like, you know, playfully, not like, you know, really shake them, but it was my way of giving him a hug and giving him that positive physical touch to where it would kind of, he could release some of that like agitation that he had already. And I also did that with some more, he wasn't particularly aggressive, he was just emotional. And then with some aggressive children that I've had, I would make them give me high fives. So if I noticed that I could see them, I could, you know, in the corner, and I could see the one, you know, getting worked up. Maybe he's like eyeing some kind of toy or getting in a you know, you just see that emotion build up. And I would call him over and I'd say, hey, come here. And he'd come over and I'd say, hey, give me a high five. And then he'd give me a high five. I'm like, oh, you can do better than that. And then he'd give me another one. And I'd say, oh, no, you can do better. And I'd kind of challenge him to try to like almost like kind of like hurt me, you know, and then he'd do it. And I was like, oh, man, that was a good one, you know, and he'd laugh. And that was my way of, one, being able to give him that positive touch, because he wasn't too much of a hugger either. And then two, to be able to release that buildup. Like, you have to physically, that's like people hit, right? It's a way to release that anger and that emotion. And so that was my way of getting him to release that feeling in a positive way, to where he wouldn't try to hit or nudge or, you know, do that to another child. And then he'd be fine. He'd go off and kind of keep playing and doing and it'd take his mind off of whatever he was getting worked up about. And then just that community support. We feel safest in the presence of familiar and nurturing members of our family and community. It's just super important to have that sense of community and belonging to, they call it, you have two levels of self-esteem. You have individual and collective. And so the more positive you can feel about your community and where you come from, that actually can impact your self-esteem and how you feel about yourself. The importance of feeling of belonging has been demonstrated through empirical work on human resilience and identity formation, and on factors that protect emotional health and personal well-being, even in the context of adversity and trauma. So like, again, like language and culture, like that is such a huge part of like identity and belonging, and knowing that this is my community, these are the language or the languages that we speak, and this is who we are, and we all, you know, are basically a family. And oh, another concept, mindfulness is a new word for a very old concept. So it might feel a little new agey or kind of like, you know, kind of fluffy. I don't know what else, how else to say it, but this is actually a really old practice that most Indigenous people have. And so what mindfulness is being aware of the present moment and aware of your feelings, physically aware of like how your body is feeling, how your emotions are feeling, and just kind of like not judging, not just being here in this moment. And so these are some quotes. My mom has her, I told her, oh, I can quote you because she has her doctorate and some degrees in counseling psychology. So these are her quotes regarding mindfulness, in that prayers bring you into the present moment, and thereby forming a deeper, more intimate connection to spirit. That is the whole purpose of mindfulness practice, is to bring you into the present moment. Part of mindfulness is always being aware of your motives. When you live in the present moment, you are being aware of your body, your emotions, your intentions, and your motivations. When you're not ruminating about the past or worrying about the future, you can find wisdom in everyday living. And so to me, when we go to gather for ceremony, when we cook for ceremony, when we pray, when we do anything ceremonial, you have to make sure that your thoughts are positive, in that if if you're cooking for people and you're angry about something and you're just feeling crabby and irritable, that goes into the food. A lot of Indigenous people at least have that teaching. And so with mindfulness, you have to check in with yourself, and you have to say, okay, how am I feeling in this moment, before you can enter into any kind of ceremonial situation, because you can cause, you know, bad thoughts and bad feelings, and you can put them onto other people. So this is super important for us, is to make sure that we're in a good place emotionally. And if we're not, then we need to remove ourselves and deal with it until we feel better, and then we can come back once we kind of worked through those. So mindfulness, there's so much research that talks about the benefits of mindfulness. So the hippocampus I was talking about earlier, that's the learning, emotion, and memory center of the brain. People who practice mindfulness have higher density of gray matter in that hippocampus. And so the concept of that, I call it a ceremonial mindset. The more we practice that ceremonial mindset, the higher amount of brain cells we have in our learning, memory, and emotion center of the brain. Mindfulness positively contributes to brain activity that deals with the executive function, so that emotional regulation, memory, decision making. Also music in the brain, you know, our most Native people have a lot of place a lot of importance on music. So this is just a quick little snapshot that shows when we listen to music, the different areas of the brain that get activated. Listening to music that we enjoy triggers the release of dopamine. Singing together, this is what I thought was super cool. Singing together as a group triggers the production of oxytocin that promotes trust, relationship building, and empathy. And I thought that was just so cool, just to, you know, we have songs that we sing together, that powwow songs, honor songs, stick game songs. Singing together and harmonizing our voices with one another produces that oxytocin, and it promotes that bonding and that trust, and it melts away all of the stress that can be caused by trauma, and it lowers those, like I just said, that stress hormone cortisol. And then there's also, you know, the technical parts of learning how to do instruments in regards to spatial temporal cognition, hand-eye coordination. There's a lot of mathematical skills involved with just tempo and timing and all of that occurs in music. The whole part concept that is necessary to understand fractions is highly relevant in understanding rhythm. Musical experiences strengthen many of the same aspects of the brain function that are impaired in individuals with language and learning difficulties, such as neural timing, precision, which allows differentiation between syllables, and music also correlates with reading abilities through practice of maintaining rhythm. So they did this study on children. So you know that there's like this little ticking thing that they put on, I can't remember what it's called. It's that little tempo ticking thing that they'll sit on the top of a piano. Well, they had these children tap to the rhythm of that ticking. And what they found is that the children who could keep beat in sync with that ticking were better able to read, had better reading skills. So when you're able to coordinate physical movement with rhythm, it can actually improve reading literacy kinds of skills. Correlates with reading skill and normal developing population, lends support to the idea that reading and the perception of rhythm rely on shared processes. So I went to visit Head Start, the Jemez Pueblo Immersion School. And this was like, to me, really, one, it was just really cute, but two, these boys come in like 2 rows, and so there's like 4 on each side, I think. You probably can't see a couple of them, but so they would have to like line up, you know, 1 to 1, so 4 and 4, and then they'd dance together in these little rows, right? And then they would turn and like face each other, and then as this man is drumming, they would respond to his beat and his music. They knew exactly when they had to when they had to turn, they did this little, like on one row, they would spear, like they were going to, it was like a war type of song. And then the other row, they would shield, and then they would switch to, so then the other side is doing that and the other side is shielding. And I thought, holy cow, that is just so complex what they're doing right now in regards to one-to-one correspondence counting, in regards to symmetry, in regards to spatial intelligence. Like all of it was just so complex for that age group. It was just, and they don't plan it that way, right? It's just part of their culture. That's just how, you know, how it is, but it just hits on all of those areas insanely thoroughly. So in thinking about, you know, different styles of dance, I know a lot of tribes follow like powwow and types of dancing. And so looking at different steps, right? So choreography, a straight step is just like, you know, just doing the tapping, and then maybe there's the diamond step like this, and then there's a hop, right? And so looking at these different kinds of steps and organizing them into like a choreography where you're saying, okay, you're gonna tap, you know, for this amount of time doing the straight step. Okay, now we're doing the diamond step. Okay, now we're hopping, going back to straight, and then we're just gonna go through that pattern of straight step, diamond step, hop, straight step, diamond step, hop. And what that can do, that just activates their whole, you know, they're having that physical movement, they're hearing it, they're having to coordinate their body with the rhythm and pay attention to this pattern. So they're working on one-to-one correspondence, rote counting, spatial intelligence, patterning, sequencing, geometry, rhythm, tempo. Another thing, you know, with dancing is that it is very physically arduous, or, you know, it's a lot of work to dance. So what happens just with that physical, like any kind of exercise that gets your heart rate, I kept trying to say rate and beat at the same time, get your heart rate up and makes you sweat. What happens is that your brain will start to release this chemical called the brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And this protein stimulates neuron connections, those links, right? And then it actually protects brain cells. And it increases transgression resistance hormone, which improves learning and mental performance. So I also wanted to show this cute little video that I took at a language and culture camp about a year ago. And so what you see here is this little girl. She's 2 years old. She was my helper. And so we're working on Indian hemp, and so it's a dog bane. And so in the corner of that lake down the shore, there's dog bane that grows. So we went and looked at what it looks like. It wasn't ready to harvest at that time, so they had brought in some stuff that was already ready to go. And so we broke the dog bane down and started processing it into the rope. And so this, you know, this is about a 4-day process. And so she's there with her grandma and helping out. And so she became kind of like the water squirter. So I'd ask her, you know, come here, come help me. And she would spray your, because you needed the friction, right, to be able to twist that speeds in. And so I kind of listed out some of the things that is happening on like a brain or developmental level for hers. One, just her motor skills in general, gross motor and fine motor. She needs that hand-eye coordination to be able to aim at the speedsin with the water and to spray it. Sciences, life sciences, dog bane identification and properties, physics, utilizing water for friction, science, technology, dopamine production, so she's getting vitamin D from the sun, she's getting exposure to the UVB rays. Serotonin production, she's barefoot, she's getting exposure to soil bacteria, which increased gray and white matter. She has that exposure. You see all the grass for the greenness and all these trees. Self-efficacy and self-esteem. So she got put in the role as like a helper, and every time she helped somebody, we just thanked her, you know, so much, and she just felt so proud of herself and that she was contributing executive function enhancement in practice. So you'll see later on that she's herself is starting to twist the rope. And the more a child focuses on an activity and stays engaged with that activity, it develops their executive function. It helps to increase it. And then neural pathway retention by exposure to native language. So let me show you the video here. Oh.
That's cool.
Everybody's learning to do it the slow way, and the fast way is to do it on your leg. So
It was probably a little bit lagged, the video with the sound, but so that's Bella helping out and also producing her own hemp rope, and just all the ways that participating in that activity and getting exposed to culture and language and what that does for her developmentally. Oh, okay. So just to kind of revisit, there we go. Okay, just to kind of revisit this Head Start mission statement, in that Head Start promotes the school readiness of young children from low income families by enhancing their cognitive, social, and emotional development. And hopefully what we got out of today is that language and culture greatly helps to support that, and that there's social emotional health benefits that come from language and culture. There's cognitive and executive function benefits that come from language and culture, academic achievement, physical health, and all of that. And so as part of this grant, Head Start has been written into the grant that Aaniiih Nakota College has. And so in looking at this and the ways that language and culture can benefit Head Start, and the ways that Head Start can also help to support language and culture, you know, thinking about, you know, what are some ways to continue this collaboration to support language and culture in a Head Start classroom for the Fort Belknap community or reservation. And so that is the end of my presentation. If anybody has any questions or comments, I'd be happy to answer. All right, Sean, did you want to ask any questions since some of the Head Start staff is here, or did you want to have any discussion, or?
No, I was just glad that there was a lot of turnout, and I hope everyone has learned a little something or a lot. And if there's anything any of the staff of Head Start needs, just give us a call and we'll arrange something or help you out in any way we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just to know that, you know, since the Head Start is such a big part of the grant that the Aaniiih Nakota College has, that I am available also. So if you need ideas on how to integrate language into your classroom, here's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me through email or through phone, and I'd be more than happy to sit down and to talk about maybe ways that I've been able to incorporate. Because when I was a Head Start teacher, I didn't do full immersion. I did a modified immersion because it can get difficult when it's like I was the only one who spoke it, and so immersion's very hands-on. So I had to modify my classroom. But yeah, if you need any language assistance in regards to your classrooms, please let me know, and I'll be more than happy to help. Well, alrighty, that is all that I had for you, for everybody. Sean, did you want to stay on the phone, or are we going to go ahead and end the
Yeah, I
call?
could stay. Yeah, I could stay.
Okay. Oh, there's a chat. Oh, yep, I can share out the, I'll send everybody the link if anybody wants to watch this again, or if they want to